Well, hello there, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Pandemic Learnings, Your 2021 Roadmap for Digital CX and Cloud Adoption. My name is George Despinek, and I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. And just a few housekeeping items. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to chime in with your thoughts and questions in the chat. And we'll be monitoring those throughout today's webinar. And if we have time at the end, we'll address some of those. But we would really love to hear your experience as you navigate these rough, choppy waters of the pandemic and trying to deliver a great customer experience during that time frame. Just so you know, John Arnold will be talking about a survey that we commissioned last year. And you will get a copy of the survey results, so not to worry about that. So all the details that John will be talking about today, you'll be able to see in that report. And speaking of which, with me today, I'm very pleased to announce that I have today's speakers are John Arnold, Principal of John Arnold and Associates. He is the author of the report, and we have Matthew Clare, Director of Customer Experience Solutions here at Mitel. Hey everybody. Without further ado, we have a lot of content to cover in today's webinar. So if we could just get it started, and again, just please feel free to ask questions throughout.
Okay, welcome everybody. So my name is John Arnold, and I'm the principal of J. Arnold and Associates. I'm an independent analyst, and I've been following the collaboration and contact center space for quite a long time. I do a lot of research in this space, and today we're going to talk, as George said, about some key highlights from this survey. And I've got three themes to cover here that Matt will join me on as well. So first, some of the key takeaways from the survey, just to set the ground for what the research covered and why it's relevant to contact centers and CX, customer experience. Then we're going to focus a bit on some of the research findings regarding the pandemic's impact on CX. It's not business as usual, as we know, so things have changed. And then taking from that, what are some of the takeaways for contact center leaders? How do you build that digital customer experience roadmap? So there's a lot of change here, and let's cover off the research first. So key findings, I'll just say a few things about the research itself, talk about why CX is so primary for customer service today, what good and bad CX looks like, very important to know the difference, and the channels that customers are using to engage today. That's really very fundamental. So these are the four, or really the three key themes I'll talk about for the key findings. So let's set the stage here with the research itself. Conducted, as George mentioned, last year. It's a fairly good sample size here, 4,075 consumers collected about equally across 4 countries, the US, UK, France, and Germany. And I'm just going to hit some of the key highlights here. As George mentioned, the research results will be shared. I also wrote a longer white paper that goes into detail about the research as well, and that is accessible for download here, and of course later through Mitel's website. Okay, so with that said, let me talk to you about why customer experience is so important. So first of all, talking about what does good CX look like? So those 4,075 consumers weighed in on this. So there were a series of variables that they were asked about, and these are kind of the top comments that basically they explained here. So as you can see from the slide, these are the leading things that define what good CX looks like. And if you consider this, it's pretty much what you'd expect to see in terms of having friendly, knowledgeable agents, being responsive, being informed, and of course having high availability for when you need service. Now let's kind of consider what bad service looks like, or CX, because that's the flip side of all of this. So we're talking here about the things I think a lot of us have lived, multiple transfers, repeating things, being placed on hold, too many steps, right? Slow response time, apps that are hard to navigate, all of these things contribute to bad CX. Now, that's not to say you can't have both good and bad in the same experience, but it sure helps to know what people think bad CX looks like. So with those pieces established, let's talk a little bit more now about what the challenges are from this. How do you strike a balance of providing good CX, even great CX, with the technology that you have? And this is really the stress point we want to focus on today on this webinar, right? Interesting to note that the bad CX variables we just talked about a moment ago are primarily about technology. Whereas when you get a good customer experience, what tends to create that is the human interaction. So there is this balance, not just about good with bad, but also providing a human experience that makes it good and having the right technology that enables agents to provide that great CX. So it's not a simple matter of improving your technology. There are two things you really have to be doing here. So with that in mind, we now know why it's important. To illustrate what that means is this, the impact, right? So what happens when you have a good customer experience versus a bad customer experience? So the next couple of slides here will illustrate that a little bit here. So first about, well, when you have a good experience, these are the kind of things you want to see happen, right? Customer satisfaction scores improve, willingness to recommend, willingness to shop or engage more often. These are exactly the kind of things you want customers to be doing. So that's the motivation to provide a good experience. It's more than just being nice and polite. Flip side, when it falls apart and the experience is bad, what happens? So as you can see here, that's what it translates into, right? These are the things you don't want to see happen. They stop shopping using your services. Now the real trouble starts. They start telling friends and family. They'll make complaints. They'll write bad reviews, right? These are all the things nobody wants to see happen when you engage with a contact center. So where do we go from here? Okay, so let's summarize what the takeaways from this are. When you have good CX, it impacts, of course, the most desirable customer behaviors, which we just talked about. Bad CX drives the least desirable behaviors, obviously. But still, what's important here is the kinds of behaviors you see here. When people start telling others and amplifying on social media, you know what, this is a problem. And of course, old school, when they make complaints, we don't do it so much as we used to, but this is what we don't want to see. Now, I like to emphasize, I've done a lot of customer satisfaction research over the years. A lack of complaints doesn't mean customers aren't happy with you. You're often, the last thing you hear is when they're going out the door, they've had enough. Well, a lot of customers, when they're not happy, they don't complain. So just because a lack of complaint doesn't mean they're happy. So don't worry about it in the sense that if they're not seeing complaints, well, maybe you should be thinking a little harder about what's going on here. The amplification here is really important. The last couple of slides show those data points. What's important here is that the incidence levels of bad CX in the research are higher. So hold on one moment, George. The incidence levels of behavior are higher for bad CX than they are with good CX. In other words, the behaviors are going to be stronger when the experience is bad versus when it's good. So again, the price you pay when experience isn't good, it's actually worse than it is when you have good experience in terms of these behaviors. Okay, with that said, now, sorry, George, I'll steer you back to where we were a moment ago. Now, channels. This is the last part of this section, but it's really important. Of course, how do they engage with contact centers? So I'm highlighting here the 4 most important channels from the research: telephony, email, online chat, and in-person communication. Now, the important thing to notice here from this slide, okay, is the idea that there's a gap between the basically the preferred and the used portion. So with that, I just want to highlight these ideas in the next slide, if I could, George. Thank you. What I want to show here is that email and telephony are dominant. That's not a surprise, which means contact centers have to continue investing in those technologies and those modes. But usage versus preference. So the idea here is that the usage of these legacy modes, telephony and email is actually higher than their preference, which means if they had other choices, digital channels, they'd rather be using those. So it's not enough to say if telephony and email are at the ready, you're going to have a great experience. No. Almost 1 in 3 are using chat. So digital channels have to be part of your thinking for investing in future technologies for contact center. There were other modes in the research like video, but they were registered much lower. But if you want to dive into that when you get the takeaways later, feel free to do so. But these are the important points here for this section. Okay, so with this idea of channels, let's now shift to the pandemic impact of CX itself. Because now we know what people are doing, let's talk about that CX response during a pandemic, how have contact centers responded, right? And then the shift to online. So again, going off those legacy channels of telephony and email, that's great, that's dominant, it's going to stay that way, but other channels are coming into the mix to define what CX is. So when we talk about the CX response, interesting question here in the survey. Had they seen a positive shift from companies during the pandemic for CX? Surprisingly, in a good way, 60% said yes. That's a really good sign. That says that contact centers, for the most part, have adjusted fairly well to the pandemic and what that means. So they've done things to make the customer experience good in these very uncertain times. So that's one of the strongest takeaways from the research here. Now, the definition of what a positive shift isn't made clear in the research, but the sentiment here, I think, is fairly straightforward. 60 versus 40, most respondents felt the shift was positive. So you've got to take that as a good thing that the contact centers are on the right track, trying to do the right things. Now, how is this shift in CX behavior and outcomes reflected in the data on a little bit more of a granular level? So let's talk about that now. The research, as I mentioned at the top, covered 4 countries. Interesting to show that the shift is strongest in the US, 71%, versus the 3 European countries here in the research sample. That's a big enough difference to conclude that something about the way American US-based contact centers are doing is getting a better outcome during the pandemic than these other countries. And as we'll see as the research unfolds, that's largely due to the fact that they've adopted digital channels faster and better generally than these 3 European countries. Now that's one way to look at the data. Now another way to look at the data is by segments, by sectors in the marketplace. So the research had a lot of coverage on specific sectors. I think there are about 8 or 9 of them covered in the research. So as we move on now to look at that differential, we see in a moment here, what's coming up, that retail had the best response amongst these segments. Healthcare had very good response too, but down the line, hospitality, professional services, education, government, not so much. Now, retail is the clear leader here, so whatever the retailers have done to improve customer service, they've had the best results during the pandemic than other sectors. So there's a lot to learn here, and this is, in a way, not surprising because they've had to make such significant adjustments. Much like healthcare, they've performed very well here. Not surprisingly, hospitality, restaurants, no one's going to them, so it's a harder gig for them to strike. But these retail and healthcare verticals have done some really good things to get good results. So there's some lessons learned in the research about what they've done. We're not going to get into that here, but just as food for thought, especially if you think about the verticals you're in, how some have done better than others. Okay, so the takeaways for this section then would be here. Overall, as I mentioned, contact centers have responded fairly well. That's a good thing for sure. CX in a pandemic, though, when we talked earlier about what makes for a good CX, that's important. But you know what? When uncertain times are here, business continuity should be as much of a focus of a contact center as it is to provide good service. When we talked earlier about retail, a big part of the stress that customers are experiencing is, are you open? When can I place my order? How do I pick up my order? Same thing for healthcare. How do I, especially right now, How do I know when I can come in and get my vaccine? These are business continuity issues as much as we're dealing with solving problems. So that's something to keep in mind with what CX looks like during a pandemic. Customers have also noticed that the biggest impact, as I mentioned, in retail and healthcare, good lessons to be learned here. And by region, I mentioned the US has probably got some good best practices to be considering for other markets. Okay, so that's kind of the summary here. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt now for the next couple of minutes before we move on to the next section. Okay, over to you, Matt.
Perfect, John. Thank you. And thanks everybody for having me today. So just by way of quick introduction again, my name is Matthew Clare. I'm head of product for Mitel's contact center and customer experience portfolio. And throughout the presentation today, really what I wanted to highlight was really what us as me specifically as a product leader in the contact center and CX space is seeing, and then talk through some Mitel specific examples of what we're seeing with the customers, and highlight some of those customer use cases specifically. So this chart really kind of tees that off by saying what we really have seen as the greatest current effect of the pandemic is obviously this huge pivot to and shifting to home-based agents. Not just home-based agents, but home-based workers as a whole. And when you talk about customer experience, I think most businesses today have really realized that it's about more than the traditional walled garden of the contact center. And throughout some of my charts today, I'll be talking about some customer experience examples where they're using our contact center tools in very non-contact center type environments. So with that, a couple quick quotes here. First from Mitel CEO, Mary McDowell. And really, this is just us saying that the way that work is changing, the way that we've worked for the last, 2 decades in technology sector, in all sectors has really fundamentally been changed here. But by and large, you've really seen technology providers come together with the customers they serve, and really rally around trying to make the most of the situation. And some of the, the charts that John just shared around, overall, most companies have seen an improvement in their customer experience, really highlights that. The other quote here from Nicola Millard from BT is really around that, working from home is not as easy as we thought it was. As a unified communications and contact center provider at Mitel, we've been doing remote working for years and decades. And, we've had technology to do this, but to make that pivot overnight for some providers hasn't been as easy as we expected. So on the next chart here, we're going to talk a little bit about what we think getting great customer experience right means when it comes to remote working. And that really starts with making sure that everybody has the tools they need to efficiently, effectively do their jobs. So making sure that your employees, your traditional contact center agents can work securely from anywhere on any preferred device. Making sure that you have a platform that can extend to supporting omni-channel type capabilities, as well as being able to mobilize with a soft phone. For a lot of, we've seen, I actually have an example coming up in a few charts where, big customer, hundreds of agents had to move all their agents to home working tomorrow. And being able to really seamlessly move from, being tied to a physical phone device and a PC at their desk to being able to work remotely from anywhere was really the biggest, immediate impact that they noticed. Collaboration, of course, always important. Being able to seamlessly collaborate with your back office workers in a contact center environment has always been very, very important. And again, when you're not in a physical brick and mortar office with everybody, having that is more important than ever. And then a lot of pressure on supervisors and managers, because traditionally contact center supervisors, they spend a lot of time silent monitoring, interactions, and whisper coaching agents. Having that breakdown of that face-to-face interaction has been an absolute problem for many businesses as they navigate the pandemic. So just to highlight that with a few customer examples, City of Oakland Park, Florida is a Mitel customer. If you're interested in hearing more about them, we have highlighted them in several areas that are publicly available on the web. But their big transition was to go from absolutely no remote working capabilities to a fully enabled virtual office and effectively a pop-up type contact center in less than a week. And this really is fundamentally driven by cloud communications and having, Mitel be in the position as a UC and a contact center vendor with cloud capabilities to really quickly enable them in that remote working environment. The second one, as I mentioned, we have a very large US financial organization, hundreds of contact center agents, and one day, as that state locked down, suddenly they only had 35 of those agents in the office anymore. So to go from 300, in-person type interactions that the supervisors and managers could interact with those agents day to day, and really being able to mobilize that workforce overnight and leverage some of the teleworking and cell phone capabilities that we as a technology provider are able to provide to make sure that really instantaneously the next day they have that business running back as effectively as it was before. It's obviously been a huge impact. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to John, talk a little bit more about online customer service.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And yes, so building on this, what customer service starts to look like during the pandemic and after the pandemic is really, really interesting. So when I mentioned earlier about relying on legacy modes, email and telephony as being cornerstones of customer service, but it's the digital channels that are emerging as the preferred mode for a lot of customers now. So the survey talked a little bit about the usage of online customer service, and I'll delineate that a bit in the next couple of slides. But this one shows here, during the pandemic, the incidence level of using these modes is pretty strong. So as you see here, it says about a little less than half, 46% said it's about the same during the pandemic, but 42% said they're using it more and only 12% are using it less. Now that's a pretty strong, I think, a validation that online channels are part of the mix. Okay, and now when we shift to the question of what are you going to plan to do after the pandemic, of course, this is intended behavior, not actual behavior, because we're not there yet, but still, now that they're using these online channels, how are they thinking about them? Well, it's even better story here. 34% say they'll continue because they find it more convenient. Another 37% just said they're already relying on it and will continue. So that's 71% of the sample will continue using. Only 10% will go back to using telephony. So I mentioned earlier about the slide showing the difference between the preferred mode and actual mode. And remember I said that for telephony and email, they were using it more, but their preference was lower. And so if other alternatives come along, they would probably use them. Well, this validates that hypothesis right there. So if you consider that during and after sets of preferences and indications for online channels, I think it's pretty clear. So the conclusions here, I've got a couple of takeaways here before I hand it back to Matt from these two slides. So there are kind of a few ideas here that I want to just touch on from those two slides here. So as you can see, online channels, right, are here to stay. I think that's a pretty clear conclusion we can take away from this. As I mentioned, 42% have been using them more and only 12% using less. So again, post-pandemic, 7 in 10 plan to continue. Pretty strong takeaway there. 37%, as I mentioned, are using and will continue. The base is already there. 34%, as I mentioned earlier, find it more convenient. That's a great use case. Convenience, okay? Telephony has its moments, email has its advantages, but it's not always the most convenient channel to use. And as I mentioned earlier, only 10% plan to go back to telephony. So these are all pointing in the direction that online channels are an important part of what drives CX now. And to kind of build on that, I'm going to hand it back to Matt for a few more ideas here, take this a step further.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, John. So the first thing I wanted to really highlight is, when we talk about digital media and these kind of emerging channels, the industry's really evolved in the last couple of decades. And when I started my career in customer experience, we were really in a very siloed kind of multi-channel world. So email was starting to pop up and become a little more prevalent. Chat obviously was there. But it was still fairly siloed in terms of who was actually managing those interactions. Over the last decade, you saw that evolve from kind of a multi-channel approach into a cross-channel approach, with cross-channel kind of being, bringing everything into a single queue, allowing an agent to handle different media types, starting to break down some of the silos. But today, when we talk about omnichannel, omnichannel is, gets thrown around like a marketing buzzword like crazy these days. Me as a technology provider, as a product leader within a technology provider, the definition of omnichannel is really important. So omnichannel is really about putting your customer at the center of the business, allowing your customers to freely, seamlessly transition between channels. For example, maybe something that starts as a phone call ends with an email follow-up, or something that starts as a chat escalates to a WebRTC video session. And providing your contact center agents and your customer experience users in whatever type of role that they're serving to really have that single pane of glass customer journey type view into the way that they handle interactions. So with that said, I wanted on my next chart here to really highlight another one of our customers, a quite large leading healthcare provider in the United States, who a few years ago, they had chose us primarily to power the digital transformation of their patient services, really ultimately being driven by the extensibility of our contact center solutions at Mitel, and to integrate into their applications that they're, both their agents as well as some of their patient care nurses, technicians, et cetera, were using. So this is not just a traditional kind of contact center, walled garden of agents sitting, dialing for dollars all day, but they're actually using contact center tools to do their jobs, to triage patient care escalations into healthcare professionals who would never consider themselves a traditional agent. Obviously, when COVID-19 hit, they effectively doubled the size of their interactions. But making sure that they had already had this tool set in place with the omni-channel capabilities really allowed to this provider to ensure that they can continue to service the nation in the United States, and ultimately work towards getting all of their patients vaccinated and cared for at this time. With that, I'm going to jump back to John to talk you through how you can build your digital CX roadmap.
Great. Yeah, Matt, I just wanted to comment that, I think you're getting at that idea of agility, right? With contact centers and being able to adapt to this really fluid market, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In the last year, this is kind of like digital channels. It's one of those things we've talked about for a long time, but having that agility, having that extensibility to really react quickly in the last year of lockdown and quarantine has really helped a lot of companies go a long way.
Yeah, and so many ways to do that, and I think we'll touch on that now. So we're going into the kind of our final section before we open up to Q&A. And by the way, folks, we encourage you can submit questions anytime into the chat window here, and we can collect those and get to them with George when we get through our deck, but we got a little ways to go yet. So coming into our third section here, kind of the action plan, right? How do you build a roadmap for digital CX? And a lot of this has to do with not just the technologies, not just how many agents you have or how you train them, but really understanding what digital channels mean, what digital CX means to your customers, and how you provide a better experience based on what's important to them. So I'm going to touch here over the next few slides on some research findings that speak to attitudes and perceptions from consumers, what it means to them, because you got to work backwards from what's important for them, find out how you address that, and then addressing it. Remember earlier that slide about the balance, right? The striking the balance of enough kind of human experience from the agents, right? And the right technology to be efficient, but also to enable a deeper human experience from the agents, because that's really what creates the digital CX, the great CX in the end. Okay, so a couple of slides here I want to show here. So interesting question here. I mentioned earlier about what online channels looked like. So the group, the response base was asked some questions here. This one in particular was their attitudes about virtual agents or chatbots. And we could, Matt, I'm sure we could talk all day defining the various types of digital tools, but we're talking here about applications that are not phone calls, that are not emails, and there are several varieties of them. But interesting mix of research data here. So you've got on the plus side, we have on the left of this chart, 39% saying they prefer them because they're faster, or they don't like speaking with agents. Now that's a very interesting, that's a very telling perception, because we saw earlier that a good experience means agents are responsive, they're knowledgeable, right? They're helpful, they get the job done. But there are times when if they don't have the right tools and can't do a good job and you get a bad CX, that's what sticks in the customer's head. I don't want to speak to an agent because every time I do, I get a bad experience. So some customers, certainly amongst the millennials as well, they would rather have this online engagement than a live person. That's one segment of the market. Now you've got the other side that doesn't really care for virtual agents, chatbots, online channels. So there are many more people who would rather speak to an agent, or that they just don't like these tools. They find them difficult to use or annoying. And then there's a small segment who haven't used them at all yet. So we don't know what they're going to be thinking. So that's one set of data points that I think is important here that helps set the foundation for what that roadmap should look like. And now I've got a second set of data points I want to talk about now that takes us to a kind of a different place about, well, what does it look like? So now we talked earlier about what those channels are, what their experience has been with them, but now what's their intent to use them later on? So in other words, we're still in that pandemic mode, right? But that's going to pass. Do they want to continue using these? So the strength of intent, this was measured across 3 different types of channels. If you can see down below, it's kind of small, but there are 3 types that were measured: self-service, virtual agents, and chatbots. So we have at the top of the bars here for each the breakouts of strength of intention. Strongly agree and agree are really the strongest sets of data here that we have. So if you just consider the purple, which are the self-service options, 48% agree or strongly agree about intent to use more of digital channels. Conversely, going to the bottom of the chart, only 22% of that sample said, no, I don't want to, disagree or strongly disagree. Now, there's a fair number in the middle, and that's to be expected because for a lot of people, these modes are still fairly new. But I think it's a pretty good indication that there's acceptance of digital channels and intent to continue using them. So a couple of takeaways from these 2 sets of data points to kind of sum that up and really to leave you thinking about what this really means. Yes, the messages are a bit mixed because 4 in 10 prefer digital channels, but 5 in 10 don't like them. So this is not a universal conclusion. This is why with your customer base, you have to kind of think a little more strategically here about, okay, for some customers, and you have to find this out, but you will, which ones like these channels, which ones don't. So don't try to impose digital on everybody because that's just not going to work, at least for now. And Matt, I think you're nodding your head on that one because this is not as clear, not as black and white as it looks. But the positive sentiment to digital channels, I think, has hit critical mass. So I think that's the big takeaway here. Now, the dynamic between, as I mentioned before, digital channels and talking to agents, it's complicated. So just like some like digital channels, some don't like digital channels, some like talking to agents as well, and some don't. So again, it gets a little messy. So you have to kind of consider that all of these tools have to be in that toolkit to provide a good CX. Which ones are going to have the best results? That comes down to intelligence, AI, and we're going to get to that in a moment with Matt. But clearly, as I mentioned before, not everyone has used these channels, so this is a lot is still to be written. But we hope, if this data holds true, when those new people come on for first-time use, they'll have a good impression. But overall, the momentum is clear. Okay, so from that, I'll pass it over to Matt, give that AI piece to this, and then we'll come back for some final comments.
Perfect. Thanks, John. And I think the kind of key thing I want to hone in here for a second is really the mixed message that the study actually was able to show. And to me, again, as spending my life in technology, what I really see that mixed message being driven by is a really old-fashioned way of doing chatbots or self-service technology in the IVR versus the emergence of AI really being able to come down market, democratize AI, if you will, into smaller, medium-sized businesses and bring it out of the larger enterprise space and make conversations more natural. And this is really what's driving the pivot. If you can think of, some of the older demographics who maybe prior to the COVID breakout and the pandemic were unfamiliar with self-service as a whole because they were always walking into a brick and mortar or they were always, doing phone service. Having a truly natural language experience for them across any channel is really powerful and a really important play in helping people adopt these emerging technologies. So first, really just on AI addressing the core business challenges. We see three pieces here. First, with your traditional contact center users, AI can be used not only to facilitate self-service at the virtual agent side of things, but also use AI to power agents to make more informed decisions about how they respond to interactions and ultimately improve the quality of those interactions. On the consumer side, obviously, I said a moment ago, huge play around virtual agents and leveraging natural language processing tools to actually make those experiences more natural than ever before. So customers don't need to wait on hold, whether it's a chat experience on a website or an SMS or, whether it's them calling into a natural language IVR type experience, really using AI can help make those interactions more efficient than they've ever been in the past. And then finally, AI is a business intelligence tool. So really being able to see what's being discussed between your business and your customers, the way that interactions are being handled, whether they're successful or not, and ultimately allowing you as an organization to optimize and continually optimize the quality of service you provide. And the impact is obviously quite significant. So there's some data points here from some research that's been done over the last few years on AI. You're seeing AI and natural language services in self-service and virtual agents, reducing customer churn, helping better contain those customers, delivering an improved average revenue for you as an organization. Reducing agent churn. This is a powerful statistic. One of the top challenges that any traditional contact center faces is keeping agents employed because you don't want to lose those highly skilled subject matter experts. And then lower average handling time. There's a lot of data out there that says the time to actually get somebody live on a phone or get an answer is still one of the top measurements that customers think of when it comes to great customer experiences, and AI really being able to drive those. How are customers using AI at the end of the day? Ultimately, improving services for the customers. And customers can be internal or external. I'll actually talk in a moment about a fairly internal type customer experience where the consumer was the business's employees using AI to more effectively handle some of those internal interactions. Ultimately, reducing pressure on staff. So taking some of those mundane interactions that can be automated away from your highly skilled subject matter experts who need to handle those edge cases. Improving routing accuracy, obviously, through natural language processing is a major deal. Giving customer more access to self-service and cross-channel, as I mentioned. And then ultimately giving your business analysts better visibility into how customers are actually navigating those customer journeys, cradle to grave, from the moment they come into your organization through the workflows or IVR flows that are routing to your groups and your agents, all the way to resolution. So very powerful experience that can be powered by AI. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on another Mitel customer, North Yorkshire County Council out of the United Kingdom. They were kind of an early Mitel chatbot type implementation, ultimately took our integration with Google's Contact Center AI for virtual agent. And what they did was they've automated some of their digital self-service, ultimately with really intelligent, seamless handoff to human agents if need to be. But this was more of an internal use case. So the customer here was the county council's employees who were trying to reach out to their IT organization for help with, password resets, hardware, software updates to their laptops and PCs. So ultimately, those IT professionals get off the phone and they can actually be, doing IT hardware, software type work. And spending less time with interaction. So a very powerful story that we do like to share because it's a good reminder that your customers aren't just your internal end users. They're not just the people who consume the goods and services that you provide as a company. It's also your own employees in many cases. So with that, I believe we're going to hand things back to John just to close out the webinar today.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So these are like the big takeaways to really leave you with, folks, that some further questions were asked here about the bigger picture about getting a good CX. So this is very telling data because, as I mentioned before, technology is a key driver of this. Your agents are the personal connection customers have to get service. But there's other factors that explain why customers don't feel they're getting a great experience. And this slide it sums it up pretty well, but things you may not have thought about. Just because you want to provide good CX or great CX doesn't mean your customers are experiencing that. So your intentions may be good, but there may be reasons why you just haven't considered. So to the far right are the highest value scores here. But it's really interesting. So if you just consider some of these ideas, these are what consumers are saying when asked this question, why aren't you getting a great CX? Well, look at what they're saying. The company, the company they're buying from, they're not aware of how important CX really is. They're not aware that the CX is more important for me than the product or service that they're selling. Or the company is not willing to provide a good CX. They're not focused enough on the mobile experience. They're not investing in the latest technologies. And some also believe the technology isn't quite there yet. It's not mature enough to actually live up to that promise. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. We're just going to touch on it here for now. But this is really saying a lot about that. Service is also, it's part of your culture. How much you want to be customer centric, because when everything works around what's important to your customers, you find a way to do that. But clearly, a lot of customers don't believe companies think like that. And if they don't, it doesn't matter what technology you use. It doesn't matter how many agents you throw on the floor. It's not going to happen because they're not trained in a way to provide CX because it's not imbued in the culture. That's a bigger problem. So technology isn't the kind of the silver bullet that solves all these problems. So considering that, I've got another set of data here to say, how do we fix this? Okay, so in this kind of the follow-up to that are these final points about, okay, so when you ask, what do they want to see to get a better CX? Well, when we talk about the technologies, they want tools that are easier to use. They want more mobile apps. Remember the previous slide said one of the key problems was not investing enough in the mobile CX. They want to see more use of virtual services. Well, that was verified earlier in the data. And a little bit more on some video. That's another piece of the puzzle. Chatbots, all of these things. So the answers that they're looking for are yes, the tools have to be easier to use. So that's just not a patchwork thing of saying, oh, I'm going to add chat. Oh, I'm going to add video. No, and I think Matt will amplify this. No, you need an integrated approach to customer service to provide that CX. So it starts at the top with the organizations understanding the value of CX, and that's been a point of our research here today to say, hey, remember the earliest section was about the primacy of CX. When you do a good job on CX, a lot of good things happen, but if you don't believe it's important, you're not going to provide it. So there's a bit of a disconnect there from the research saying that customers, if a lot of them don't believe you're committed to providing a good CX, these tools that you see here in this slide are only going to get half of the job done. So to kind of set the stage here for our Q&A, guys, so we'll go to our last slide before we pass on to our Q&A, and that's here. So the key takeaways from this final set of slides: digital CX is more than technology, right? It's only part of the roadmap. That roadmap has got to include an organization-wide focus on the customer, why CX is so important. So technology is still needed, of course, yes. So 1 in 5 feel it's not good enough yet. Okay, fair enough. They'll come along. But bigger picture, a lot of businesses still don't understand what CX really is. So these tools, these technologies can really help, but bottom line, perception is reality, right? They made it clear. If you provide a good CX and a digital CX, make it easier to use, make it more mobile, have more online digital channels like video, like chatbots. That's what's going to change that perception into that reality of, hey, happy CX. We saw earlier what that translates into. The business case should be very clear. Okay, and I think with that, Matt, we are ready to engage. We are here.
All right. Wow. That was very impressive. Thanks you so much for all those insights and all that great information. I know I've learned a lot, but I'd like to just take a moment here to see what our audience is talking about. And I'm glad that people are bringing in the questions. So this is a great opportunity. We do have a few minutes. I guess we can share some of the questions with the audience. I've got an audience member asking, did you get any specific feedback on consumer reaction to pop-ups and other distractions while shopping online?
Okay, so that would be pretty granular in the research. No. I'm familiar with the full set of questions that was asked in that survey. It wasn't, mainly because I think that would be, those are kind of e-com experience issues. But the research didn't go to that level. I suppose within the retail segment of the customers, that probably would have been an issue. But they didn't go that kind of far down the customer journey, that whole set of steps that gets you from check-in to check-out. Would be good to have follow-on research about that for sure, but I wish I could say. But I think we've all lived that experience for sure. Matt, you've been there.
Yeah, you'd see me nod for sure.
Yeah, let me ask Matt this question. So can contact centers provide a really good customer experience only using digital channels?
I think it'd be tough. I think a lot of the data says voice is still king. Voice is still the most familiar. The first thing that everybody walks around with this in their pocket, right? At the end of the day, and if you Google a company or an organization that's serving you, the first thing that pops up is their location and a click to dial button on your phone. So I think it'd be difficult for most vendors. The balance, it's really, the question is more about balance. And to get that balance right, I think you need to really hone in on who your customers are and what their preferences are. I don't think that's something that everybody's super finely tuned to, and what their channel preferences are. Obviously, years ago, we used to say that the millennials are coming and they're terrifying and they love social media and everybody needs to be ready for social media. But the reality is, in the last year, everybody of my grandparents' age has become very familiar with using WebRTC video applications as a result of this pandemic. So I think the time is now, with the proliferation of digital channels, to really start adopting as some of those demographics pick up these tools and become more familiar with them. Voice is still king. I'm having a hard time thinking that voice is going away soon.
I wouldn't mind adding a little bit to that, guys. Two things. First of all, being, with that research in particular, but the world we're in now, being pandemic, we're all isolated. And you hear a lot of talk about, well, what customers really want is empathy, right? They want that human contact because they're not getting it. So that's where, to you saying that, Matt, about voice is king, it's probably even more important now, because people don't get that warm and fuzzy feeling on a chatbot. They just don't.
Yeah.
And that's key. But flip to that pandemic, as we know, call volumes are up, and contact centers can't handle all that. They've got two choices: they hire more agents, which they can't afford to do, or they find ways to automate the service. And of course, a lot of that volume is about questions that are fairly routine inquiries. How do I pick up my order? When are your hours? And all that kind of stuff. Those can be automated, right? And so there's opportunity here for those chatbots to handle a lot of that self-service stuff that is clogging up, the call flows. So during pandemic, we have to accept the call volumes are higher. And so there's a challenge for the contact center. How do you meet that volume? And that's, I think, where the chatbots have a big job to play.
So a couple of party questions along those same lines, John. We have a question here asking whether having more online interactions, does that translate into needing fewer agents to handle those online interactions?
I'm going to comment, and then I think Matt could probably add a few to that pieces, because when companies think about AI, often the first thing that comes to mind is cost savings, right? Automating things, having fewer workers, because I don't know what the stat is, Matt, but I know labor is the biggest cost element in the budget of a contact center, right?
Yep.
So anything to reduce that, they're going to be drawn to that as the reason for AI and automation. And that's obviously, I think that's the wrong reason to be going down that road. Right, Matt?
I totally agree. So what we've actually seen is that it's not necessarily human replace. What it's done is it's put more of a burden on your agents to be subject matter experts, highly skilled subject matter experts. Because if I have this natural language AI engine that I'm conversing with and doing these virtual agent interactions, and heaven forbid I need to actually talk to somebody, that somebody's better be able to answer my question, right? So it's this very delicate balance of, can it remove some of your lower tiered support workers and automate some of the interactions they're handling? Yes. But what you may find is, as you do that, the interactions you get become more difficult and you require a more highly paid subject matter expert to actually answer those questions. So it's a very fine balance. And this is really why AI, as a technology provider, we've really pitched it as not human replace, it's human assist. It's human assist at the front end in the virtual agent section, but also from the agent assist perspective. So using AI to actually whisper coach some of your more junior agents so they can behave in a way that they seem to function to your customers as a highly skilled subject matter expert.
Yeah, I just want to add, with the automation, voice used to be first resort, now it's last resort. And you want it that way. But that also means by the time they get to voice, they've exhausted every other avenue. They're only coming to you with the hard ones, right, Matt? They're not coming to you for the easy ones. So those agents have to be prepared. And that's, I think, a big use case for AI.
Awesome. Okay, so just to close things out, so now that we're through this first year of CX during a pandemic, what do you think is next for CX in 2021?
You want to go first, John?
Okay, that's crystal ball time. Oh, wait a minute, we're in 2021, but yeah, I think we have to be optimistic. We will, this pandemic will pass, and we'll there'll be a new normal, whatever that looks like. But yeah, I think the exciting part with this, now that video has become so mainstream, there's going to be more cases for using video in the customer experience. And that is not just that's just not two talking heads here back and forth, but it's things like co-browsing, right? It's sharing information in real time on, the see what I see experience. That can be a way to enhance the customer experience because now you're getting a little more immersive in the problem set. And then you think about too, contact center is where most of this stuff happens, but you also have technical service where you might have agents who are out in the field who might need to demonstrate things in real time to you. So you could be talking about, it could be saying, a question about, oh, how do I administer the COVID vaccine? And well, you may get connected to someone who's right in a health clinic with video walking you through. Let me show you how we're doing it. That could be incredibly valuable, as a way of making it a more immersive experience. So I think that's one way to look at this for sure. And I think we will get there a little bit more on the use of things like AR and VR, augmented reality, for more enhanced, again, more in-person kind of experience, but it's still virtual. There'll be a segment of the market that wants that, but we're still a ways out on that front. But so I think there's going to be more tools, right, Matt?
Yeah, more tools is the way, absolutely. So what I've been seeing is, last year was really focused for many companies on mobilizing the workforce to work from home efficiently, bringing on emerging tools so they can get their call volumes under control and adopting some of these new exciting omni-channels. This year, I see I'm crossing my fingers that things start getting back to normal soon, like the rest of the world. But I think what we're going to see is more of a focus on the supervisor experience, and making sure that supervisors and managers have the tools they need to actually ensure that they're set up for success and optimized when it comes to customer experience. So thinking about things like quality management and scorecarding and survey and CSAT capabilities that maybe haven't been implemented, all the way to things like workforce management, making sure that you got the right people at the right times to handle those volumes across channels where not every contact center adopts some of those supplementary tools. And that definitely will go a long way, especially as a result of not having supervisors and managers be face-to-face with many of their employees as things progress. So yeah, I would say my big focus are the other kind of supplementary tools that really round out great customer experience.
Fabulous. Well, this has been great. I could talk to you guys for hours. This is so I just lost track of time. I'm looking at the time thinking, man, we're over time. So I wanted to thank you so much, Matt and John, for all your wonderful insights and data points. And, if you want to learn more, we're going to send you the results of that survey that John talked about. And feel free to reach out to either of us, any of us, and continue the conversation. And I hope you found this webinar as enlightening as I found it. And with that, I'm going to sign off and say thank you again. All the best.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Paul.